by the time a couple realises they're actually in strife and we need to get some help, that's been going on for actually years. They've had some arguments, and the arguments have increased in intensity and hostility, and they're not recovering from the arguments. And after 4 or 5 years, it's got too much, and now we need to see a counsellor.
Welcome to an episode of This Catholic Life. Conversations about life's ups and downs, big and small, how we deal with every situation imaginable, whatever life throws at us, but still manage to be sensible, practical and joyful. Today's show, we're following up on Marriage Matters, a previous episode where we talked to Francine Pirola about marriage and the what Catholic marriage means and all the different struggles in society and marriage. And she promised to come back, and I'm very grateful that she has. So we're going to have another conversation about family life in the world where ordinary Catholics can actually contribute to the ongoing health of marriages and life. So I'm your host, Peter Holmes, and today I'm joined, as I said, by Francine Pirola.
Well, good morning, Peter.
Thank you for coming back. Before we get started, just a reminder, if you like the show, you should subscribe on your favourite podcast device or on our website, thiscatholiclife.com.au, and that way you won't miss an episode. You can find all this in the show notes. Subscribe and all the different podcast devices you can use at our website, thiscatholiclife.com.au. You can also find, by the way, little show notes, handy little references. Any links that we talk about today will go in the show notes, so you can find the stuff there. So let's get into today's topic. We talked last time we met about marriage and the kind of the macro things that are going on and the different marriage programs, the different sort of marriage counselling that helps, the making a decision, discerning marriage, that kind of thing. But today we wanted to talk more about the practical things that ordinary people can do. Let's start with being aware of other people's stuff. Like, there's a kind of an idea of privacy, isn't there?
There is. It's really interesting. On the wedding day, we want the whole world to know about it. But then, particularly if we're having difficulties, we retract and we don't want anybody involved. And
what do you think causes that?
Look, I think we've got a cultural challenge that we need to really question, just generally, but also in the church. And I think we need to be more open about our struggles. So the kinds of stories that you tell and that we tell through our programs around just how we've faced difficulties in our marriage, I think is really helpful, because one of the things that does is it normalises challenges and difficulties for people so that they don't feel so alone. And we're always struck by, when we run our marriage seminars and so on, how many people will say to us, my goodness, I thought you were speaking straight into our marriage experience. It was like you've been in our lounge room listening to our argument. And it's like, because we're actually all pretty similar in that regard. We all have differences of opinion. We've got differences in our sexual differences in the way that we relate on what's important to us and so on. So I think just being prepared to be open and honest with each other around, I'm finding this really hard.
Yeah.
In a way that doesn't disrespect our spouse or
marriage itself.
Right. Because
I remember as a kid growing up, I went to a public school, and pretty much every reference to marriage was, it's the end of life.
Yes,
you
the
have
ball
fun,
and chain thing,
you live your life, and then you get married as the kind of, well, it's all over now. We might as well just give it up. The ball and chain, as you said, or they used to tell jokes. His son goes to his father and says, "Is a man wiser after he's married?" And he says, "Yes, son, but it's too late then." There's a kind of dead, like the idea that marriage is giving up life. And even some of my friends were always in a Lutheran seminary, and some of my friends would act this way. When I got married, some of them would show up at the flat and talk to my wife and say, "Can Peter come out and play?" This kind of negative thing, that she was the drag on my life and my fun. And it's not a healthy view of marriage. And there's quite often a dead, and that they used to tell a lot of jokes in the public school about that your love life even ends with marriage. So if you're going to have fun with your love life, you have it before you're married. Yeah. And the whole idea of a bucks night sort of builds that in. And then that life after marriage is kind of, you've just settled. Yes. And you're just kind of just existing from then on. Yeah. That's a dangerous end of it. And we don't want our honesty to sound as if it's affirming that end of things.
That's right.
But on the other end, you don't want to make it so idealistic that it's unrealistic.
That's right. So it's part of, I guess, approaching it as a great adventure.
Yeah.
And like, all adventures.
And it's
there's going to be difficulties, there's going to be challenges, it's going to be taxing. You've got to exert yourself to get to the top of that mountain or run that marathon. But the rewards are really worth it. And I think if we can bring that kind of balance and make sure that we're talking about the struggle, but also talking about the triumphs and how we resolve them, so that there's always that positive end to the story.
That there's actually it's worth it.
Yes.
I guess that's the key for me, that it's worth it.
Yes.
So that it's difficult, but it's worth it. It's the most difficult thing you'll do and the most rewarding thing you'll do.
Yes.
I'm going to throw a left field thing at you here. I once saw some stats of divorces and success, happiness in marriage amongst people who come from cultures where their marriages are arranged.
Right.
And that the couples themselves, the reason I did this is I was shared a block of flats with some other people who were in the same faith, and one of the couples there had an arranged marriage, and they met on their wedding day.
Wow.
And they had the most beautiful marriage. And I was saying, hang on, all my Western hackles are coming up at this point going, what? No, that's not right. You should be miserable and not compatible in some way, as if our method of selecting spouses has somehow infallible. Completely not, by the way.
Yes.
So frivolous, and our reasons for choosing spouses are often quite bad. However, what was interesting about their culture is that there was so much formal structure in it that in the best scenarios, which theirs was a fairly good example of, her family actually had to vet him.
Yes.
And his family had to vet her. She went and lived with his family for a month, and he lived with her family, her brothers, for a month. And they were rigorous in checking him out, his character and his, admittedly, his financial credentials, his personal nature. Was he going to treat our sister the right way? And all this, a really rigorous thing. And they had a vested interest because their families were going to intertwine if this happened, and they were very much involved in it. Now, there's all kinds, we've all seen the nasty stories in Western media about arranged marriages and how awful they can be. Yes, they can. When you have awful people making decisions for you, it's always going to be bad. But what was interesting, and this seemed to be the key, they started trying when they got married, whereas Westerners seem to start trying and they stop trying when they get married because they think, I've achieved what the purpose of dating and relationships, was. Now I'm married, I can relax because I've got, I've hooked them and and I don't have to keep trying.
Everything hangs out. Look, I think that's a really interesting observation. Just as a little caveat there, we've often joked that Byron and I are an arranged marriage because our parents, particularly our mothers, had this thing going. This just sort of, the Byron and Fran were betrothed. It's a longer story. I won't go into it. But before we even started dating, there was this, one day, when they get married. So there was this culture between our two families of this collusion. But anyway, for another time maybe.
Look, it's not a bad thing. Again, in a perfect scenario where your parents actually love you, they want the best for you, and sometimes they can see things that you can't see. Now, unfortunately, in Australia, I would suspect that most of us we just simply don't have a culture or an awareness of how we could be a healthy contributor to someone else's decisions.
No.
So even when I want the best for my friend, I actually have no model, no structure. There's no kind of way of being involved in their decision which is helpful and constructive and respects their free will. Yes.
You've got to get that balance between the individual couple has to freely come to that marriage. I think the other thing we've noticed is that in the kind of the Western norm now, which is, to meet someone, date, move in together, cohabit for 5, 7, 10 years sometimes before they get married. One of the challenges of that is that we know scientifically that the experience of falling in love, that science calls it limerence, that there's all this biochemical thing that goes on in the brain that induces this state of euphoria. It gives us lots of energy, it drops inhibitions. All of that is happening in often this early stages of dating, often in the cohabitating state.
Yep.
And those sorts of things, if you would transfer those really positive, and they're beautiful, amazing experiences, we would say it's not true love at that point. It has to mature to a more mature bonding and conscious loving, that at that point it's sort of biochemically dominated. But if you're not experiencing that in the context of a sort of a permanent arrangement, you're losing the benefit of all of those positive feelings. And particularly if you've cohabitated, and even if you've progressed out of limerence into a kind of a more stable sort of thing, but you've cohabitated for 5 or more years, you've kind of done all that really lovely, exciting thing of setting up home and the shared project of establishing a life together. That's now not associated with being married. That's associated with before you were married.
And so if you go yearning for those happy tingles later in life,
you're kind of saying
you're associating it with something outside of marriage. Yeah.
And so I think that's a real danger, is that in our culture we want to have everything and have the good stuff now, and we don't. Why would we wait to get married? We can just live together now.
Well, in fact, in most young people's lives, I'm talking outside the church and inside, unfortunately, the hookup culture is almost replacing the dating and living together culture. So people are just casually hooking up and in a series of sort of very short relationships, and then they finally get to hanging out with someone for a time, and it actually gets sadly quite removed from the idea of sexual intimacy. And then by the time they get married, sexual intimacy has all this baggage attached to it of all prior relationships. So.
Yeah, so it's an interesting phenomenon. I can't see. I have a hard time advocating for the model that your friends had with its fullness, and it probably needs to have all the fullness for it to work.
No,
but I can see why it might work.
The reason I mention that is because it's so far outside of our Western experience, and I reacted because of the free will of the individual seemed to be usurped. But even in spite of my reaction, I could see that there were elements of that decision-making which is completely lacking in our Western society.
Yes.
I'm glad my parents weren't involved in decision-making. They, mind you, had been separated before I got married. So it was kind of a good thing that they weren't involved in the decision. But in some ways, even people who have good contributions, we don't have a healthy mechanism for them to give that help. So this is pretty much what we want to talk about in today's show. How do ordinary friends, let's bring it down to friendship because that's the most common situation. But how do we, you've got a grandchild already, so you've already had some experience in your children making these big decisions, and my children are just getting to the age of potential dating. How do we as parents, but also as friends of people, involve ourselves in a healthy way, not in a busybody way in those decisions?
I think one of the simplest things is to really just firstly to be alert for the signs.
Right.
So one of the things we're really aware of is that by the time a couple realises they're actually in strife, and we need to get some help, that's been going on for actually years. They've had some arguments, and the arguments have increased in intensity and hostility, and they're not recovering from the arguments. And after 4 or 5 years, it's got too much, and now we need to see a counsellor.
Right.
Well, the early signs of that are being broadcast to the people around them.
Right.
It might be when you're dropping the kids off to school and there's a couple of the mums or the dads at the side of the football field that are just sort of making some throwaway comments, often the negative kind of stereotypes. But if we're alert to it, that's an opportunity to say, pull that person aside at some stage, at the barbecue or whatever, and say, hey, how's things going between you and your wife or you and your husband? I'm always happy to talk if you want to. If you want to talk some things through.
The early signs is a big deal, even in marriage. You've probably heard of Gottman's research where he figured out he could spot a couple that would be together in 5 years' time with about 90% accuracy. And what he figured out was that he was noticing, without realising it, tiny movements of their eyes when they looked at each other, and it was about whether or not they had respect or contempt for each other. And when he could, without realising it, he was spotting just the tiniest sign of contempt, disrespect for the partner, and that meant 5 years they were gone on an almost reliable basis. And that even the smallest expression of contempt for a spouse or disrespect or kind of putting them down can be picked up really quite early and not suppressed but challenged in a healthy way.
Yes, and obviously like when there's the anti-marriage or the anti-wife, anti-husband jokes, don't participate in them, try and counter them with something positive. I think that's part of kind of building that culture without coming across as being we don't want to suppress things, because suppressing language just means it goes internal and people don't feel comfortable to talk to you about their struggles. But when they want to talk, we want them to say, hey, I really want this to work, but this is my struggle. Can you help me? Yeah. And you want them to be able to associate you as a positive influence. Yeah. Because it's not helpful to go to friends and have your friends just agree with you and beat up on your spouse.
But also it's not helpful to go to them and have them suppress you.
That's right. So,
and often a sarcastic comment or a snide comment about a spouse is actually a disguised cry for help.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And so if you've got your ears pricked, ready to kind of pick up on those. A really lovely term that I've loved that comes from Michelle Weiner-Davis, American therapist. She talks about guerrilla divorce busters. You kind of got to go, you're not out there with your placard saying, or your nameplate saying I'm a divorce buster, but just being alert in the community. And she has this vision for just these sort of raising community awareness so that we're in the spaces where those early signs are. So I guess a couple of practical tips, what to say, what not to say.
Yeah.
I think really important not to continuously be relating it to us. Sometimes it becomes, oh, yes, I've got the same thing in my marriage, and it then just becomes this mutual.
Or even that I'm worse than you. I've got it worse, yeah.
Those kinds of things are not helpful. I think to just be really attentive to the person and their story, validating the emotional experience doesn't necessarily mean validating their interpretation or judgment around the situation.
Or the solution that they're proposing.
That's right. But sometimes just acknowledging that you've got really intense feelings, you've been deeply hurt by this situation, but then also turning it around to what's something you could do that could make this situation better.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are under this myth that, well, I can't do anything because my husband or my wife isn't cooperating, that we've got to have both of us. Now, there's some merit of truth in that, but I think it's important to remember that we can do a lot on our own. And the way to prove this is to say to them, is there something you could do today to make your situation worse? And everybody can think of something they could do, right? I could go out and sleep with the secretary. I could come home drunk. I could throw something. I could do whatever, right? If we can single-handedly make it worse, we can single-handedly make it better.
Right.
And so to kind of claim that power for ourselves, that it only takes one to tango, we can change the dance. If we change our steps in the dance, that changes the nature of the dance. You might not see the impact immediately, but if we're consistently doing that and making choices in our relationship to improve the situation cumulatively, that will make an impact.
We should pause here and say quite clearly that the Catholic faith does not advocate for anyone having to stay in a marriage where there's abuse.
Right.
So if someone's being hurt or harmed or viciously attacked, and that's not a situation we're talking about here, and there is a legitimate reason to remove yourself from immediate danger and from constant grinding down in that sort of way, and that requires specialist help, and possibly in some cases where someone's unwilling to change that kind of behaviour, it possibly means removing yourself to a safe place permanently. That's absolutely not – it's not a Catholic thing to say you have to stay in the marriage no matter what, because constantly subjecting yourself to abuse is not good. It's not part of what the marriage plan is.
Well, and it's also not loving towards the other person.
It isn't.
Because you're facilitating behaviour that is actually bad for them, bad for their soul, bad for everybody, bad for the family, bad modelling. So it's not actually a loving a loving action.
Because the purpose of marriage is love. The end of marriage is the fruitfulness that comes from that love. But the purpose of marriage is love. And if that purpose is being constantly thwarted by a fatal flaw in one or more person's personality, that has to be addressed before you can even talk about that marriage being fruitful. It may even be that the most loving thing to do to someone who's criminally abusive is to make them suffer the consequences of that criminal action, to put them in whatever consequences of that action are appropriate, which may be jail or whatever. So, and that's more loving than allowing them to continue to be an unloving person.
That's right. That's right. And I think we often have lost sight of, I guess, the eternal perspective on our decisions. We're very much a temporal kind of culture now. So we're making decisions on what is going to immediately increase my happiness or well-being now or in the next hour or the next, maybe we might push it out to a year. But we need to be thinking really long-term and thinking.
So let's sort of look at the flip side then. That's an extreme situation where you actually can't break through without really strong professional help, and that person still has to be willing to change. It's possible, but they have to be willing to. Sometimes people do come back from that situation, not as often as we'd like. But on the other side, there's the kind of till tiff to us part, it's unbearable, this relationship, because we're arguing all the time. Well, that can be dealt with. That can be a situation where if two people are willing, there's actually very simple sometimes professional, but sometimes even just simple tools which are accessible.
Yeah, absolutely. And community helps a lot, I think, to just have, other couples who are collectively, if we're all working on our relationships together, it builds that kind of culture of this is something this is how we do marriage in this community. I'm
not a weirdo. This is a
right.
normal, ordinary experience.
We don't go into autopilot. We don't just sit back and let the marriage run itself. We're proactive and intentional in how we approach it. We're looking for opportunities to improve our relationship, making time for the date nights, going on retreats together, accessing some of the relationship skills and so on, I think are all just simple, practical ways that it helps if there's others in your community that's normalising that.
You have to look for ways which are actually conducive to you as a couple, though. So, for example, my wife and I have tried many things over the years, some of which have been spectacularly unsuccessful. So we went to marriage counselling at one stage just because we wanted to get better at things. Things weren't fantastic. We just thought, let's not wait until it falls down. Let's actually get proactive. We went to this marriage counsellor. He was very professional. And my wife and I have personalities which are very cynical. And so I think we had a much more constructive conversation in the car on the way home saying, what was he going on about? And we agreed to disagree with him so strongly that we actually grew closer together ourselves. And some retreats we've been on have been so fluffy and lovey-dovey and, you want to do this and that. And we're just not that sort of couple. And it just didn't help. But when people actually were straight shooters and say, you've got to actually respect each other in this way and here's how you can work on straight communication, that's been really helpful. Now, lots of different people have different things, but you've got to be prepared to seek out things that work for you and be prepared to say, if someone else suggests something, okay, that might work for you, not working for us.
Yeah. But also, I guess, to be relentless in finding something that does work for you.
Keep looking.
So don't just say, I don't like going on weekend retreats, or I'm not interested in going to see a counsellor, or he or she won't go to a counsellor. Find something you can do.
Right.
And look, there's a plethora of options out there, and not just, we have a bias towards the Catholic options because it just brings a worldview and
a wholeness to it, isn't it?
A faith dimension that we think is a real asset in terms of rising above the challenges. But there's lots of other Christian groups particularly, but also secular groups. Right. So you can usually find something.
So I knew a long time ago when I was looking in the marriage area, it's nearly 20 years ago now, there was a program called Retrovia here in New South Wales, and they helped couples who are really struggling. And I understand there's a move to get them back, but you were mentioning earlier there were some other options available in New South Wales for marriage. People who are couples who are looking for either pre-marriage or, and more importantly, post-marriage sort of development.
Yeah. So there's what we would call, there's the run-of-the-mill just sort of marriage enrichment, and there's lots of different options in the Catholic Church. Different communities and groups are running those. So there's things like Marriage Encounter that has a weekend retreat. So what would this look?
It's a weekend retreat.
Weekend retreat. Your husband and wife go away together. It's residential and it's presented by couples, and a priest has a strong faith element, a very strong focus on developing your communication skills.
Right. And it's mostly between the couple. Like the couple
it's all between the couple. It's very private. You're not doing sharing with other couples.
Okay.
It's all just and most of the couples retreats are very much around respecting the privacy of the couple. So they're not scrutinising. Our own Smart Loving Marriage seminar, same kind of model, not residential though. Again, very respectful of the privacy of the couple.
Right.
Slightly different content. So we focus more on the the sexual differences and how men and women approach relationships and love differently. So
it's kind of controversial in today's age.
It sure is. But we've been doing it for 30 years and it works. It resonates. It gets the cut through, and it's really liberating for couples to be able to name this is some of the things that it's affecting the dynamic between us.
Let's take a brief diversion in this direction.
Okay.
There's a couple of what's the word for them? They're kind of like ways of receiving love, ways of being happy, sort of books with the, what are they called? The indexes, or there's another word for them.
Models. We call them models of love.
Yeah, where men tend to receive this kind of love more strongly than other kinds. So, for example, there's one where it talks about recreational companionship. So
that's Willard Harley's work.
Yeah.
Yep, his needs are her needs. Yep.
Yeah, that's right. And so I remember reading this and thinking, what? That's not actually, that's kind of a big deal for me. And then I realised I actually really, really needed to hang out with people and get into hobbies and things like that. And that's part of my makeup. And that I hadn't realised it was a big deal. And the society is quite contemptuous of this boys and toys kind of thing, and the boys still playing games and can't they grow up. There's actually a really healthy mechanism within the male psyche which tends to lend itself towards that sort of thing. It's not uniquely male, but it tends to be more male than female. And my wife hung out with me and did these things with me until we were married. And then she didn't hang out with me anymore because she was already married. She didn't need to.
But she had other things she had to do.
Exactly.
And you divide and conquer. It's interesting. We find the same. Byron really likes it. If he's gardening or cleaning the pool, he just really loves me to just come and hang out there and talk to him while he's doing it. He doesn't necessarily want me to help him. No. It's just hanging out with him. And I'm like going, can I get on with my stuff now?
Yes. Well, and the other thing is the communication thing. When Susie and I are a little weird in this area because I'm much more talkative and I like to talk about my feelings, and Susie's not that.
Right.
She's this sort of Germanic Polish background where she absolutely doesn't like that, but she does like to organise things. And so our communication is a trade-off. She's not allowed to talk to me about money or organisation after 9 o'clock at night because I can't sleep otherwise. And I'm not allowed to talk to her about philosophy or theology after 9 o'clock at night. So it's just like 9 o'clock at night becomes this sort of truce zone where we don't introduce anything difficult. But in these situations, it's interesting that even though they're generalisations and we don't want to make them into sort of rock-hard stereotypes of male and female, there is actually a good healthy respect for the different ways in which our spouse is loved. I spent the first 10 years of our marriage trying to make Susie happy. Susie's my wife, just to be clear, in case you think Susie was my secretary or something. No, Susan's my wife, and I spent the first 10 years of my life trying to make her happy by my mechanisms, the ways that I received happiness. And she didn't want to be in clubs or be involved in, activities. She didn't. Her happy day is home on the couch with a book. That's her happy day. And for me, now it's becoming more happy as I get older, but it certainly wasn't where I was going. And I thought, I failed her. All she had to do all day was to sit with her book, and I should have been getting her involved in something. And we were not doing well in that first 10 years because we were investing so much time and effort into making each other happy in areas we didn't care about.
Well, it's the very first thing we cover in our course. And the reason why we call it smart loving is because it's a smarter way to love.
Exactly.
Is to love the other person the way they experience love, not by instinct, which is the way we experience love.
Well, a huge amount of effort of mine went into these areas, and it was wasted because, it's like my wife
appreciate the effort, but you're not really hitting the mark.
My wife was saying it's like a massage. It's nice, but you don't need it every day. You don't care if you don't get it. It's kind of just nice. Whereas, I try to describe it to young blokes now when they ask me about this. I say, if there's a big green button, that if you press that little effort and your wife's happy, wouldn't you just go, cool, I'll just press that constantly? Well, in my wife's case, the dishes is one of those buttons.
Right.
Now, it doesn't register on my, it's a necessary chore or everything, but I don't get the same sort of pleasure if someone else does the dishes. So, okay, thanks.
Yeah.
But it's not a big deal for me, but for her it's a big thing. So if that's the button, doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense to me, I should be pressing that as hard as I can, as often as I can.
Yeah, and that's, and that's smart. You're using your energies in a positive way. And it's actually genuine love because you're focused on her.
Not me.
Not on, just not the mind, not even necessarily focusing on you, but that mindless kind of autopilot kind of love that is not really attentive to the individual.
Yep.
So, I absolutely agree. I learned the hard way with Byron. When I've got a problem or I'm distressed, the way I react and want to be loved is for someone to come around and listen to me, let me talk about it, let me work it out, and we churn it over and just be present to me while I try to work out what to do. That's not the way he likes to be loved. He comes home from work and I can see there's something going on. I'm like going, you look like something's worrying you. Would you like to talk? And the answer is usually, I'm fine. But I'm undaunted. I'll wheel around, 10 minutes later, you're really sure you don't want to talk about it? Never worked.
Have you seen Mark Gungor's video on the male brain, the female brain? Absolutely brilliant, yes. And again, my wife and I are slightly different in the way we communicate, but his idea of the boxes in males' brains, when you talk about something, you take out the box that's to do with your mother-in-law, and you put it there and you talk about what's in that box and then you put it back. Whereas generally speaking, and it's only generally, but everything's connected for the women.
Everything is connected, isn't it?
It is. And what's interesting is that in some areas I'm like that, and in other areas my wife's like that. So it's not a perfect analogy. But having said that, it's fun to talk about these things. I mean, if someone sees that, sometimes they get offended because they think they're being boxed into a stereotype. Yes. They're just thought starters.
Yes.
They're just ways
and we always differentiate between a generalisation and a stereotype.
Yeah.
A generalisation is true because it is generally so.
More often than not.
A stereotype is when you've categorised someone because they belong to that group, they must behave like this.
Yes.
And I think we want to avoid the stereotypes,
sure.
but we can certainly, and it's helpful to study the generalisations because it's kind of like getting a bit of a roadmap that's going to give us a direction on where to look.
Yeah.
Or a treasure map so that we know where to dig. To find actually the specific truth around that individual.
Yeah, and sometimes stereotypes can be they can be bad in a couple of ways. One is that they make out as if you don't do this, you're not a real man or a woman. Or the other end of a stereotype is that, look, this is another example of how crap men are.
Right.
Or how bad women are at this or whatever. None of these things are just ways of understanding each other.
Yeah.
And how to understand, how to communicate. And
we would argue, I mean, there's a bit of a trend in the culture that's kind of goes along the lines of, well, look, he's like this, she's like that. You know, he's never going to want to talk that much. She's never going to want to have sex that often. Just get over it, right? And we kind of say, well, no, the differences between us are actually good for us because they call us out of ourselves to reach into the others' area. So it's part of God's plan, I think, to make us different so that we're stretched beyond our natural kind of boundaries a little bit and called into love.
Young women often say to me, he won't talk. And young men often say, she won't have sex. And almost always they're surprised when you say, look, if you put two human beings together, no matter how compatible they think they are, if their sex drives matched perfectly, that would be a miracle. It's never going to happen that two people have exactly and timing perfect and everything. Yeah. There's always going to be a legitimate adjustment. And one of the mistakes in some of the more, I think, silly ends of marriage advice is someone has to give the other one whatever they want. That's just simply not the case. It's always a genuine respect for the other person is the starting point. And that part of that respect is wanting to make them happy and within the realms, but nothing I do to make someone else happy can ever undermine my dignity and my free will as well. It can never be about me just giving up myself and my own free will and something that makes me profoundly uncomfortable or something like that. It should never be about that.
So can I articulate the way we talk about that on our weekend, and you can argue with me then.
I hope so.
So we would start by pointing out that women generally have a stronger need for intimate conversation.
Okay.
They connect and emotionally with their spouse, with their husband, primarily through intimate conversation. It's not the only way, but that's a really strong factor.
They need to feel heard.
Yes, to feel heard, but they also want to hear about his interior life because that's how she gets inside him.
So it's an intimate communion, really.
Yes, but expressed primarily through a verbal exchange.
Right.
For men, it's generally much more physical, not exclusively about sex, but sex is a big part of that.
Sure.
And that's how he literally gets inside her, but also that's how he will express his devotion, affection by doing things, by touch and so on. That's a much stronger feature for most men. When you've got those differences, it's automatically going to create what we call a desire discrepancy.
Right.
She has a stronger desire. I have a stronger desire than Byron for intimate conversation.
Right.
Therefore, it creates a power imbalance.
Right.
He has power in that area of our relationship because he simply doesn't need it as much. He didn't create the situation. He's not on a power trip. It's just the nature of if I need something more than he does, it puts me into a position of being less under his power. Yep. And similarly the other way around.
Yep. And often you see that in unhealthy situations in a relationship where
it becomes a trade-off.
Yeah, he won't talk to me. She won't have sex. It's kind of like a power play.
If you talk to me, well, then I'll give you some sex. And
it's because you're not doing this for me, I won't do that.
That which is really toxic and unhealthy. But I think the call of love is to recognise that it's a genuine need and desire of the other person. That's a godly desire, a man's desire to be physically intimate with his spouse and to, and it's not just to satisfy a sexual need, I think most men actually want that sense of deep communion, emotional communion that comes through lovemaking.
Yes.
So, and her pleasure is really important to him as well, not just his own pleasure. But that's a holy need, and we need to honour that.
Yes.
And similarly, her desire to know him emotionally is a holy desire as well.
Yes.
So the call is that we put out to couples is having firstly addressed the wounds that we've inflicted on each other by exerting control over the other.
Yep.
And how damaging that can be to our psyche, and kind of reconciling over that, to then go forward with a new mentality of joyful availability. So it's not this coercive, it's not this resentful, okay, well, if I really have to, but this sense of...
And also no accounting involved. I gave you this many conversations, you can have that.
Exactly. So, but just approaching this is the way that I can really show you how much I love you, and I'm really happy to do that for you.
Sure.
And to kind of work, I guess, on the interior disposition that doesn't see that as an imposition, but as something I can joyfully embrace.
Also looking at the variety, one of the things, I don't like Harley's work that we mentioned before, by the way, because it's so negative. Do this or you'll have an affair or something. But I do like that he's identified the variety of ways. So most people recognise that men like sex. Most people recognise that women like that intimate communication. What surprised me was the other part, so the non-sexual physical touch the women really enjoy.
It's the affection.
So when it's not associated with or a kind of always a lead into sex, she actually likes the physical touch. Where what was the other one? There's
the recreational companionship. There's financial security.
There's the domestic commitment.
Yeah, domestic support.
Peace at home. One was a really big one for the guys. Admiration was a big one for the guys, and that's one of the most crucial areas in young men's lives and in husbands. What we're noticing is that because we identify so much of our identity with work, the men almost desperately go to work looking for affirmation, whereas in our theology and our understanding of marriage, and even in human terms, it should be that their base identity comes from their relationships with friends, and especially their spouse.
Absolutely.
And that if they receive affirmation in that field, they're much braver and less affected by the random person at work and what they think of them, because they're secure in themselves. And nobody's just an island in themselves. But if they're receiving that affirmation from their spouse, mate, I mean, there's a guy called Stenson who came and did a talk in Sydney, and he said he had a room full of about 1,500 people, and he made them all. He said, everyone turn to your husband and say out loud, "I feel safer when you're at home." Now, that was just the phrase he chose to use. Now, we all knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And then he said, and watch them. And the wives all turned around and said that to their husbands, and he said, their chest just got a little bigger.
Yeah.
And he said, because there's a genuine, and he says, you all feel this, and you feel happier and safer when they're at home, but this you've never actually said it out loud.
Yes.
And that makes a huge difference to him wanting to be home, and also realising how important it is, and the security of his presence. Yes. And the affirmation has power.
It does. It does.
Far beyond what we realise.
And we spent the first years of our marriage missing this cue, me particularly. Byron's work is very intense. It's very demanding, long hours. We got back from our honeymoon. He started a project in Brisbane. So every Monday morning for the first 6 months of married life, he was on a plane up to Brisbane for the rest of the week.
Oh, dear.
So we were in a fly in, fly out marriage from the first day. So, it's been part of our life. And I've often been really negative and critical about the demands that his work makes on our time. And it's really detrimental, because if he's getting criticised at home, and at work they think he's a hero because he's bringing in the clients and solving the problems, it's not much of incentive to hurry home to me. And
it's also it's almost a subconscious preference then for where we're affirmed.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
And even when this happens both ways. It's not really a particularly male thing, but it can happen with a woman in her workplace as well, or at home, or wherever she feels most appreciated and affirmed. And one of the deepest problems, at least I've noticed in Susie's life, is that when she's not appreciated verbally and demonstrably for the great stuff she does in the home and wherever else she is. So it's often, I've sometimes been grumpy that she's off helping another friend and taking a dinner to somebody else who's in trouble. And I realise they're super appreciative of her in that sense. Now, I'm not saying she shouldn't do those things. I love her for doing those things.
Yeah.
But she should get much more appreciation from us who receive so much more from her.
And how easy is it to just overlook the really mundane things?
And
the fact that, you made the bed every day. The fact that you take the garbage out every week, the fact that you, all those really simple things that we overlook. And
so perhaps this brings us back to what we said we were going to talk about at the start, which is how does an ordinary person get involved? And that mundane is probably the word I'd use. I was at a talk recently where I gave some advice on marriage, and someone came up and said, how do I get my husband to do X? All right, okay, there's a problem there to start with, but I always say you're never going to motivate him by telling him off. Mm-hmm. You're never going to motivate him by saying what you want to happen. Because it's always just nagging. And then if you demand something and they give it to you, then it's not even a gift. It's sort of just a fulfillment of a demand. Yeah. You've robbed them of the opportunity to be generous. Yeah. However, if you take something that's good and take something that's positive and affirm them in that, it changes the dynamic. Yeah. Now, my wife heard me say this in another thing. And then about 3 weeks later, she said to me, I really like how you hang up the towel for me every day. You're always neat about that. I hear some other guys aren't. That's really good. And I thought, what a weird thing to be happy about. And then I thought, hang on, she's been listening to it. And I immediately now am, without even realising, I'm looking for ways to be neat around the house and put all my stuff in the right places. Now, clearly she's been very cunning and realised if I say this one thing that he did right, it was almost the only thing I got in the right place. So and then it becomes, look, I want to receive that affirmation again. I want to. And so if we can seek out things that are positive and good.
This is part of our smart loving framework, because one of the things that we teach couples, a really practical skill of applying it, is daily gratitude.
Right.
So what do I appreciate about you? And look, we do it with our children all the time, right? You don't necessarily put them down every time they make a mistake. You affirm them when they do the right thing.
If you're on the ball, because it's not a natural state of parenting to do that.
No, but we sort of know that that's a healthier way to interact, to highlight the positive and maybe just ignore or overlook the negative.
Right.
And in time that often takes care of itself. Well, we can educate each other about how I like to be loved by affirming when he does it the right way.
When you did that, that was awesome.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Really appreciated that. That made a big difference to me.
But let's say I'm talking to friends who are married. Often, again, rather than calling them out, I mean, definitely some people need to be called out on unhealthy behaviour or gently nudged in the right direction. But often, preemptive affirmation is actually, it's a much better thing. Like say, hey, I love how you guys are like this, or I love how you did that, or this is an opportunity to do that. Would you say that's like the positive affirmation actually is?
Yes, yeah. And as long as it's genuine. I think particularly Australians,
we don't like disingenuous.
We're very sceptical about kind of the undeserved affirmation. Praise. So it's got to be grounded in reality. So obviously it has to be true. But I think we don't do enough of actually naming and calling it out. We often assume the person already knows it, or if we said it once, that's enough. Yeah. We don't have to keep saying it. And that is, I think, having spent a bit of time, we lived in America for a year and a half, the cultural differences between the two countries are quite interesting to observe. In America there is this generalised optimism and I think it actually comes back to partly their Thanksgiving traditions,
right? Where
there's this built into the culture is this idea of that we give thanks for the good things in our life,
right?
Whereas in Australia with its penal history,
right,
that perhaps that's not quite present as effectively there.
Yeah, our celebrations tend to be more about revolutions and complaints and things
yes. Yeah. And that kind of spills over into our sort of daily psyche and our daily life.
Right.
And so I think that this conscious habit of just cultivating, and we know that even from the positive psychology, this idea of gratitude, it's like a wonder drug. Like it's...
Can I throw an example at you? So if I see someone in church, I remember how much we struggled as a young couple in church when our kids were just endlessly playing up.
Yeah. Oh, my children were all perfect in church. Just putting that out there. Not.
Yes. Well, mine are now because there's a sort of a culture in our family where the older kids have kept the younger kids in the habits, and it's interesting. Once you've got the older ones in a certain habit, the younger ones will follow. But we went through stages where it was nightmarish. We tried every bribe we could possibly think of and different punishments and different ideas, and we were spending, I reckon, in almost all the masses in the first about 5 years of our kids' lives, we were in and out of the mass every time, and I always missed the important things. But when I see a young couple struggling now, or even just a young mum sitting there with the kids, I make a point of going up to them afterwards after they've had a particularly horrible mass and saying, "You're doing a great job.
Yeah.
This is really hard. I remember this stage. Stay with it,
Yeah.
And the difference in it, because they look at you with disbelief because
Yeah.
they've just had the worst experience they've ever had, and they're seriously considering never coming back to mass again.
Yeah.
And just that affirmation, even in a supermarket, that simple affirmation of somebody saying, "Hey, it's worth it.
Yeah.
Good on you. You're doing a great
Yeah.
job. I know it feels like it not now, but good on you."
Yeah.
And that can make such a difference in people's lives.
And even I've sometimes done that even when I've seen, say, a parent in a supermarket who's probably not handling the situation well, right? The kid's doing a tantrum, they're crying on the floor and stamping their legs, and the mother's, trying to drag them away. I'll often even affirm them in that, even though I don't think that the strategy is the right strategy.
Yep.
But I say, "Oh, you must be so wrung out. I know how hard it is. You're doing a great job.
Yep.
It's all worth it. I know, you'll get through this and it's all worth it.
Yep.
The child's going to be fine." And that's often enough to help them gentle down a little bit.
Because the perception
with the
is that
child.
everyone's negative, because the only thing you hear is this kind of negative connotation, and sometimes you hear it out loud.
Mm-hmm.
So positive is very important, but also the practical things. I remember the first time someone offered to babysit for us so that we could go on a date. Just changed the world.
Yeah.
I mean, just the simplest thing, especially in that young family age. And the church talks a lot about the value of family and fruitfulness and children. Let's be proactive. Let's actually get in there and say, "Can we help out? Can I come and do some washing for you? Can I?" I mean, now sometimes that gets a little tricky and someone coming into your space, but being practical, being helpful, offering a meal. There was a period of time when we were really struggling, and that was with the youngest's health. People just showed up with meals, and it felt humiliating to start with because we were so proud about our own coping mechanisms. We realised actually this is really helpful, and it changed the dynamic. It was really important. Just practical helps.
Yes, simple things like that. And I guess being sensitive to the autonomy of the couple,
not trying to override them and tell them what to do. And
so, like the mother-in-law who barges in and starts,
I'll solve your problems.
Yeah, cleaning up and all that sort of stuff can feel judgmental. So not that my mother-in-law does that. I don't want that to be implied. But I'm very conscious now with my daughter and their new baby that when, I'm over at their place, it's just to be respectful of what's helpful for her, and because they're struggling to keep on top of all the tasks. But actually what she really values is company. And she says, "Can you just sit down and have a cup of tea with me, Mum?" And so I can have an adult conversation.
That's right.
She doesn't want me to do a load of washing. She doesn't want me to go and wash up the dishes or whatever. And I'm itching to get into that sort of stuff. She just wants to have a conversation. So just, I guess, checking in with them, finding out what they actually want. And
again, taking the time and effort to find out what's good for the other person.
Yes.
And giving them what they need.
Yes.
And it's often not what we want or we think they need.
Yes, because often it's bothering me that there's dirty dishes in the sink.
Right.
But it doesn't bother her.
Good.
She's really comfortable with that.
Or at least there's things that bother her more than that.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. It's not high on her priority.
Yeah.
And so it's really, we've got to be prepared to step into their value system and not impose our own.
There's some ways in which values is always a problematic word for me because it basically says whatever I value is good. It should be important, but we have as Catholics a very clear set of guidelines about the dignity of each human person. So even if their values say this is okay, sometimes we need to nudge it a little bit and go, well, hang on, are you dignified in this?
Yes.
Is your personhood affirmed here? Is your independence, is your free will and fit? Now, and so I'm not saying all people who use the word values are that, but there's actual objective reality about a human person which can't be compromised no matter what they think. However, dishes are not in that realm. Dishes are not. I mean, they're not in the realm of undignified behaviour. We probably need to bring it down to practicalities now. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I'd like to see more of is a kind of a way in which local communities can journey more together in this realm. We need to find creative ways, and I don't think there's one model that's going to work in every parish.
No.
We need to find creative ways to be actually available to each other in community, which aren't imposition on the other person's privacy, but are actually genuinely available to them with a non-judgmental way, which actually helps them do the good thing, which is form those communities.
We're really excited about the opportunities that are presented to us through the digital technologies.
Right.
There are gazillions of fabulous programs out there. We don't need new courses and new ideas. There's lots of them there. Some of them are produced very well. They're quite contemporary and so on. But it's how do we access them in a way that's convenient and works in with our life, particularly when there's a whole lot of other reasons why you might be wanting to spend your precious free hour somewhere else. So we're putting all of our things into an online environment so that they can be accessed easily. And the thing that I think is going to make a big difference long term over that is that it used to be that in order to facilitate a course or to run a program, you needed somebody who was trained.
Right.
And that training can take significant time and investment. With an online and facilitated environment, you remove the need for that. So an ordinary couple, a couple in a parish or a school community could get together with 2 or 3 other couples and say, let's just do this together.
It's like the talking head syndrome. You actually you have the input from outside, and then you then are free to work it through in your own way.
That's right. And they can then focus on doing the things that can't be replicated through an online environment, which is creating the space of hospitality.
An actual community.
Praying together and so on.
There's no substitute for that human contact, is there?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really is the foundation. And if you look at the programs that are being really successful in that line, things like Alpha, for example, that part is still the foundation of what they do. It's getting together for over a meal.
Yep. That's why it works, actually.
Put the video on. It really could be probably any number of different videos, but then it's the conversation.
So here's why I like the Smart Loving approach is that you've mentioned Alpha. I don't like Alpha. I think its program is actually designed to create Anglicans, and it's very successful in that. Unfortunately, we were looking for Catholics. But having said that, is no doubt that the method they use is effective. And I'm very delighted to hear that model is used in the Smart Loving area, because I don't think the method is in fact, the method's very effective, and your content is excellent. So we're going to put the Smart Loving website in our links, and I'm going to pump that up and say that's a really good thing. And I'm going to say thank you very much for being part of this conversation. I hope that we can eventually get Byron on the show with you and we can talk more, because there's so much to talk about with marriage.
Sure is.
But thanks for coming to this conversation. Unfortunately, we were out of time, so we need to wrap it up. If today's podcast has got you thinking or arguing with your podcast device, let us know, especially on this topic. There's plenty of stories out there. If there's something else you'd like us to talk about along these lines, or something we've missed, you think, then drop us a line at info@thiscatholiclife.com.au, or on Facebook, Discord, Instagram, Twitter, any of the social media outlets that we're on. Remember that this is a uniquely Australian Catholic podcast, and we think that's an idea worth getting behind. So tell your friends. Before we go, it's time for shout-outs. Francine, do you have a shout-out?
Oh, I shout out my absent husband. Again, he's praying for us at the moment, so
good on him.
From afar.
Indeed. And I think I'll shout out to my kids who've put up with our fumbling attempts at marriage and parenthood for a long time. Hopefully, they'll recognise one day we were doing our best. That's all for now. Thank you for listening to This Catholic Life.